What if I told you that everything you think you know about the greatest traitor in Christian history is incomplete? What if I told you that behind that infamous betrayal lies a deeper, more tragic truth that has never been fully revealed? For 2,000 years, one name has echoed through the centuries: Judas Iscariot. His name has become the very definition of betrayal. We know him as the disciple who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver, surrendering to greed. We condemned him in sermons, painted him in shadows on church walls, and remembered him as the darkest of men. But have you ever wondered if that picture is missing something? If there are truths hidden between the lines that no one has dared to speak? Amid the shadows of the temple and the cold gleam of silver, Judas walked beside the Messiah. He touched miracles, heard secrets, broke bread with him, and in the end he did the unthinkable. Was it really just greed? Or was it doubt, fear, and a faith cracked deep within his soul? Perhaps, like Thomas, he carried an unseen struggle, longing to believe, yet wrestling with disbelief. The most infamous kiss in history was no gesture of love, it was a dagger, and the hand that gave it was the same hand that once accepted bread from the Messiah himself. What if Judas was not only a traitor, but also a victim, a pawn in a divine chess game? Or, as the forbidden texts whisper, a man chosen to fulfill a secret mission? The story we share today reaches beyond the pages of Scripture, because Judas' story is not only about betraying Jesus, it is also about the fear, the pride, and the longing for forgiveness that live within every human heart. Many know Judas for the 30 silver coins, yet the true tragedy was not the silver itself, but the wound it carved into his soul. In this video, we will gather the forgotten fragments of his story. Together we will confront the weight of betrayal, the shadow of fear, and the faint but powerful hope of grace. From the traitor condemned in the canonical Gospels, to the hidden hero whispered of in Gnostic texts, from the silence of the Church Fathers, to the schemes of the enemy, we will bring together every piece of the Judas puzzle. And when this journey ends, you may never hear the word betrayal the same way again. If you have come not just to hear a story, but to uncover the truth that lingers in the shadows, then stay with us. Because what you are about to hear may change your understanding of Judas forever. Now, let us return to the night when darkness was thickest, to a garden where Jesus prayed alone, to the moment a man stepped forward and with a kiss began a story that still haunts the world. Night settled thick over Jerusalem. The trunks of the olive trees leaned into one another, casting long, jagged shadows beneath the moonlight. The wind stirred the leaves, filling the garden with a restless whisper. There, among the silence, Jesus knelt, his hands pressed against the cold stone. His words rose like fragile smoke, soft but unwavering, as he prayed to the Father above. A few disciples kept their distance, their eyelids heavy with exhaustion, and yet in their hearts they knew this was no ordinary night. The air itself seemed to wait, heavy with an unseen approach. Far off within the twisting streets of the city, movement began. A torch flared, then another, until a line of fire stretched out, winding its way toward the garden. Around the flames gleamed shields, spearheads, and the hard eyes of men resolved to seize their prey. In front walked a figure whose face flickered in and out of the torchlight, sometimes revealed, sometimes swallowed by shadow. There was no need to wonder who it was. Judas, the man who had shared bread at the same table, walked the same roads, witnessed the same miracles. Now his steps fell heavy, as though each one tried to conceal the fracture within him. Those behind him held their silence, waiting, their eyes fixed not on Jesus, but on Judas. For tonight, the key to betrayal lay in his hands. The crowd pressed between the trees at the garden's edge. The smoke of torches hung low, staining the air with soot and shadow. Jesus rose to his feet. His gaze was steady, calm like a clear lake unshaken by the storm gathering on its shore. The disciples edged closer, then faltered, held captive by fear and awe. None dared to speak first. Judas stepped forward. His face bore the weariness of a man torn between choice and destiny. The torchlight flared across his jaw, then threw his shadow into two opposing directions, as if even his own body revealed the struggle within. He moved closer, raised his hand and bridged the final distance between them. "Greetings, Rabbi." The words sounded like a greeting, but they carried the weight of a sentence. In that moment, the silence cracked. A kiss was no longer the language of love. It became history's sharpest mark. Darkness, as if waiting for that single gesture, magnified the glow of the torches. The crowd caught the signal. Shields shifted, spears lifted. Yet Jesus' gaze did not change. In his eyes lingered a mercy standing at the edge of the blade, retreating, a fragile light still reaching to call something back. The memory of hands once reaching for the same bread now existed in that narrow space between two breaths. "Friend, is this why you came?" The words echoed in Judas's heart. He did not step back, but for an instant, hesitation flickered in his eyes, spreading, fading like ripples in water. The crowd he led saw nothing. They were waiting for a sign, and they had it. In that moment, shadows overlapped, spears moved, and a soldier rushed forward to seize Jesus. One disciple leapt in defense. The metallic hiss of a blade tore through the night. A scream rose, an ear severed and dropped to the ground. The torches flared brighter, but the light no longer illuminated faces. It fell into the darkness. For all understood, there would be no turning back. Jesus met the attacker's agony with a glance of compassion. He bent to the man writhing on the ground and touched the bleeding ear. Silence fell again, as if even the wind had ceased. For a moment the spears hesitated. How could such mercy exist on such a brutal night? But Judas stood unmoved. His hands grew heavy, haunted by the weight of 30 silver coins. They were no longer in his pocket, but pressed like an unseen burden against his chest. Inside him, a question long avoided stirred awake. If all this was part of the plan, then who was I? If not, what have I done? These questions whispered like voices from the outside, but they came from nowhere except his own heart. The disciples stared at one another with fearful eyes. None called Judas by name, because the cruelest truth was this: sometimes a name is heard even when it is not spoken. That night, Judas's name echoed not in the torchlight, but in the silence of the shadows. The dirt path to the garden gate lay veiled in smoke. As the soldiers prepared to take Jesus away, Judas remained behind. He shared neither the pride of the crowd nor the cries of remorse. He simply stood there like a stone suspended between two abysses. As Jesus was being led away, no one noticed the tear that slipped silently to the ground beneath the olive tree. Whose tear was it? No one asked. Some questions, once spoken, shatter the very answers they seek. And yet in that quiet drop, the answer was already present. We stand now at the edge of a deeper truth. Betrayal is not always born of greed. Sometimes it rises from fear, sometimes from pride, and sometimes from a desperate search for truth in the wrong places. And we today often recognize only in hindsight which voice we chose to follow. So ask yourself, what is true courage? Is it declaring loyalty with bold words, or is it daring to face the fear that hides within our own hearts? Night fell deeper. Footsteps faded, and one by one the torches vanished around the corners of the streets. The garden was silent again, yet it was no longer the same. The trunks of the olive trees stood firm in the darkness, like two ancient witnesses hiding what had just taken place. When the wind returned, every rustle in the branches seemed to whisper a single phrase. It all began with a kiss, or so we thought. The silence pressing on the garden was heavy, almost unbearable. Some of the disciples stared into the shadows as the last torchlight disappeared. Whispers died away, and moonlight gently covered the scene. Jesus was being led away by soldiers, the sound of chains blended with footsteps echoing against the stone streets. What remained was a scattering of frightened followers and the olive trees rooted in the earth. Peter, his breath ragged, tried to steady the knife trembling in his hand. The weight of what he had done pressed upon his heart like iron. The others held back. No one dared draw close to a hand stained by violence. Yet in Peter's mind lingered Jesus' final glance, not anger but mercy. That look pierced him deeper than any blade. Judas, meanwhile, stepped back and stood as if nailed to the ground. As the crowd's murmur faded, only the pounding of his own heartbeat filled his ears. Each beat reminded him of the silver hidden in his pouch, but the coins were no longer metal. Each one had become a cold nail piercing his soul. As the soldiers led Jesus away, Judas kept his eyes on the ground, his thoughts circling the same question: was I chosen, or did I choose this path myself? The question echoed like thunder in the silence of his heart. Around him the disciples scattered, some fleeing to their homes, others melting into the shadows of the city. None went near Judas. He was no longer simply a disciple. With one kiss, his name carried the heaviest burden in history. As moonlight streamed through the branches, the wind rose again. Leaves rustled, and the call of night birds echoed in the distance. Even the sounds of nature seemed altered, as though creation itself was recording the moment, sealing it in silence. Judas stood motionless, then at last, with shoulders slumped, began walking out of the garden. His steps were slow, heavy. Behind him the olive trees disappeared into the dark, overshadowed by the betrayal they had witnessed. But the shadow was not bound to that garden alone. It would stretch across all of history. For betrayal, once committed, becomes a wound carved not only into memory, but into every heart. That night, the scar of that wound had only begun to form. As Judas dragged his feet toward the stone streets, each step grew heavier. The echoes of chains faded into the night, and within him the emptiness grew. The silence left in the garden had entered his own soul. The night that began with a kiss was sealed forever, not only in his memory, but in humanity's. The moon slipped behind the clouds, torchlight dimmed in the alleys of Jerusalem, and one thought kept repeating in Judas's mind. Everything had begun in a way that could not be undone, but the echo of that night reached far beyond the garden. Behind the city's stone walls, sleepless prayers were whispered, children woke in fear, and priests murmured in the temple. The seed of betrayal had not been sown in one place alone. All Jerusalem felt its shadow. By morning its silence would spread across every street, and every face would bear its mark. For the night that began with a kiss had become a wound in the conscience of all humanity. The betrayal that began in a garden grew into a tremor, shaking the entire city. For some it was the dawn of fear and despair, for others the greatest test of faith. Yet for all, one truth remained. That night, history itself shifted, and even now its echo lingers in our prayers, our choices, our silences, because betrayal never wounds just one person. It breaks through generations and reshapes the fate of an age. But the story did not begin in the garden. Before that there was a table, an evening where bread was broken and the cup passed from hand to hand. At that table, an unseen line had already been drawn, a crack spreading among the 12. Pride and jealousy, quiet suspicion and misunderstood loyalty, all sat side by side. So let us go back to that table of the chosen 12, to the invisible fracture on the surface of the bread. In what comes next, we will see how the crack widened and how it prepared the path of destiny. As evening settled over the stone streets of Jerusalem, a table was prepared in the upper room. The flicker of oil lamps painted long shadows across the walls, giving each face around the table a veil of mystery. The 12 sat together, the chosen ones. Each heart beat with its own rhythm, some steady with devotion, others restless with doubt. As Jesus broke the bread and passed it, his eyes met each disciple's gaze in turn. Every glance seemed to pierce the soul it touched. Yet on that table lay an unseen divide, a quiet boundary between loyalty and hesitation, trust and fear. With every moment it grew wider. Peter, as always, leaned forward, his words spilling out like fire. Beside him, John held the innocence of youth, storing Jesus' words deep in his heart. But in the corner sat Judas, silent. His eyes wandered over the crumbs of bread, worry trembling at the edge of his lips. The questions within him grew heavier, hidden from the rest. When Jesus lifted the cup and shared it, the air thickened. This was no ordinary meal. Every word carried the weight of what was to come. "Truly I tell you," Jesus said, his voice both tender and cutting, "one of you will betray me." Whispers swept the table. The disciples turned to one another in shock. "Is it me, Lord?" Voices echoed, heavy with fear. Each man searched his own heart, while an unseen burden pressed on the table. Peter nudged John to ask, and John lifted his head to whisper, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus' eyes paused on Judas. He dipped a piece of bread and placed it in Judas's hand. This was no simple act of sharing. It was the moment the unseen line shattered into a chasm. When Judas reached out, silence wrapped around the table, settling onto his fingertips. No one dared meet his eyes. Yet the air itself seemed to shift, for the seed of betrayal no longer belonged to one man alone. It hung thick in the room itself. Then Jesus spoke softly, "What you are about to do quickly." His words echoed like a final bell. Judas rose, the lamplight falling across his face, his shadow stretching long against the wall. The divide was no longer hidden. At the heart of the table, a fracture had begun, one that would reach into every soul present. When Judas moved toward the door, the others lowered their eyes. His footsteps echoed into the night, and everyone felt it. The fragile line at the table had split into an unbridgeable rift. As the door closed behind him, those who remained exchanged uncertain glances. Whispers rose like smoke. The weight of that moment settled over the table like a shadow. Peter clenched his teeth, his hand twitching toward his sword. How could this be, he muttered under his breath. John, however, kept his gaze fixed on Jesus, waiting for an answer. Jesus remained silent. His eyes alone stilled the room, even as they carved a wordless farewell into the hearts of his friends. The crumbs left on the table seemed to speak of a bond already broken. Thomas whispered, his voice trembling, "One of us. How can we bear this?" His words rippled through the hearts of the others. No one felt secure. The same fear churned in every mind. What if I fall too? What if I fail as well? Then Jesus lifted his head. His eyes moved slowly over each face at the table. "Tonight you will all be shaken, for when the shepherd is struck, the flock will scatter." His voice weighed on the air, pressing the truth down upon them. Each man felt the sting of questioning his own loyalty. Peter burst out, "Never, I will stand with you, even to death." His words rang bold, but inside his chest a storm raged. Jesus looked into his eyes, sorrow deep as the sea. "Truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." The words fell like a blade into Peter's heart, yet no one wanted to believe it. Each clung desperately to his own fragile faith. By then, Judas's footsteps had long since faded into the night. Outside, the moon rose high, pouring pale light over Jerusalem's stone walls. Inside, the bond of the 12 had begun to unravel, thread by unseen thread. The table still stood, but trust had already slipped away. The cups of wine remained untouched. The red within no longer spoke of celebration, but of blood drawing near. Bartholomew hid his face in his hands, praying silently. Matthew pressed his trembling palms against his knees, trying to steady himself. Jesus spoke again, breaking the silence. "Do not be afraid. At the end of this road there is light." His voice was gentle, but the air in the room did not yield. They knew the steps of the one who had just left would return, carrying the weight of destiny. They looked into one another's faces, tired, bewildered, helpless. Tonight it became clear. The table that once looked whole was already veined with cracks. And soon those cracks would break wide into wounds. As silence thickened, it seemed another table's shadow stretched across this one. Some dreamed still of triumph, others already felt the thunder of the storm. No one dared speak it aloud, but all of them knew this was not just a night of betrayal, it was a night when every heart would be tested. Peter's hand still moved restlessly, the knife tracing the edges of memory. "I will not fall," he told himself. "And if I do, I will rise again." It was not so much courage as fear hardened into determination. Thomas stared at the scattered crumbs of bread. "I only believe what I see," he thought. But what if tonight, sight was not enough? Matthew's eyes drifted to the money bag at the end of the table, not with the calculation of a tax collector, but with the ache of a brother learning repentance. Simon the Zealot flexed his fists, loosening and tightening them, while in his mind an old song of freedom still rang. Victory comes by the sword. Then Jesus broke the silence, as gently as a stone dropped into still water. He did not raise his voice, nor did he rebuke. He simply reminded them of the weight of true service. Only moments earlier, he had stitched the room's fractured spirit together with nothing more than a basin of water and a towel. Some had noticed, others had not. Yet the water at the bottom of the basin was still cloudy with the dust of their feet. "Whoever wants to be the greatest among you must walk the path of the least," he said, "for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." The words seemed to linger in the air, filling the cracks of the room. Each man took his portion. A chair leg creaked, a breath grew heavy. Pride, for a brief moment, leaned quietly against the wall. John remembered resting his head against Jesus' chest. The rhythm he had felt there was steady, unchanged, even as storms gathered outside. That same calm now seemed to rest on the table like a cloth, but it could not fully cover the fracture beneath. For even when words pierce the heart, sometimes hearts are slow to believe. Matthew glanced again at the string of the purse. He didn't want to think of money tonight, yet money, like a shadow, has a way of thinking about people, even when they try not to think of it. As the lamp caught the rim of the cup, deepening the red stain along its edge, a question stirred within him. How can a cup be both covenant and division at the same time? Outside the window, the wind pressed against the stone walls. A rooster crowed in the distance, then fell silent, as if the night itself refused to let morning in. Inside, two realities sat side by side, love and fear. Love knelt to wash the dust from a brother's feet. Fear clung to the edge of the table, swelling its voice and shouting, "Never will I," which would prove stronger. Some truths are only revealed at dawn. Jesus lifted his eyes and looked at each one of them. I give you a new commandment. Love one another. His words glimmered like the flicker of an oil lamp. Love one another, because soon they would scatter, and the only thread to bind them would be this command. Peter's clenched jaw softened. Thomas's brow tensed. Matthew exhaled a weary sigh. Each man felt the weight of his own burden, reshaped by that single word. Through the doorway, the night slipped in as a narrow line, and it was night. That single sentence draped a shadow over the table. Judas was hidden in that shadow, but it did not belong to him alone. It stretched across every heart in the room, the craving for power, the hunger for approval, the voice of fear. That narrow line became a crack, dividing each name it touched. Peter lifted his head. Lord, he whispered with determination, I will follow wherever you go. Yet his own heart echoed, I will follow. Jesus' gaze lingered on him, like a father watching his child run, knowing he will stumble but loving him all the same. You cannot follow now, he said gently. Later you will. And that word later settled on the room like a heavy stone. Matthew leaned toward Simeon. Who is the greatest? The question hovered, then fell quiet, embarrassed by the chill of freshly washed feet. Simeon answered only with a faint smile. The sword's work belonged elsewhere. Jesus set the chalice back at the center of the table. My body, my blood, for you. The words came not as ritual, but as lines from a farewell letter. Their meaning was not fully understood, yet some meanings are not grasped in the moment, but in the scar left behind. Tonight, he came to leave a scar. An unseen choice lingered at the table's edge, to grasp power, or to release it and kneel. Which is closer to God, sitting at the head, or carrying your brother's burden? Once more the wind rattled the window. The lamplight wavered. Jesus rose, circled the table, and laid a brief touch on each shoulder. That touch would outlast his words. Then he walked toward the door. The time had come. Descending the wooden stairs, his footsteps echoed into the stone courtyard. Outside, the night had embraced all that was spoken inside. Those left in the upper room looked at each other and saw their own frailty reflected back. The darkened rim of the chalice marked the moment, a sign that by morning would become remembrance. Across the city, in the temple courtyard, a few torches flickered. The chill of metal clashed with the whisper of linen robes. A scribe etched a single word into wax. 30. Another table was being prepared, set not with bread and wine, but with numbers, prices and silver. Soon the shadows would speak in the language of stone and coin. Jesus lifted his eyes and looked at each of them, one by one. I give you a new commandment. Love one another. His words glimmered like the flicker of an oil lamp, burning, fading, then burning again. Love one another, because soon they would scatter in different directions, and the only thread binding them would be these words. Peter's jaw unclenched, Thomas's brow twitched, Matthew let out a long sigh. Each of them carried their own burdens, and the words gave those burdens a new weight, a new meaning. The night crept through the doorway like a thin, dark line, and it was night. That single sentence spread across the table like an unseen shadow. Judas had slipped into that shadow, but it wasn't his alone. The darkness reached into each of their hearts, ambition, fear, the hunger for approval. That thin line stretched, cracking through every name around the table. Peter lifted his head. Lord, he said, his voice low yet steady, wherever you go, I am ready to follow. But within him, a quieter voice whispered, I am ready, I think. Jesus' gaze lingered on him, like a father who knows his child will stumble while running, yet chooses to walk beside him anyway. You cannot follow me now, you will follow later, Jesus answered. That word later pressed heavily on the room, bending time with its weight. Matthew leaned toward Simon. The question hung for a moment. Who is the greatest among us? Before falling embarrassed to the floor. The chill of freshly washed feet was too real, too humbling for such a question to stand. Simon gave a faint smile. The sword's place was not here. Jesus set the cup back at the center of the table. My body, my blood for you. His words did not fall like ritual, but like the tender lines of a farewell letter. In that moment, the meaning was veiled, hidden. Meaning often comes not in the instant, but later in the scar it leaves behind. Tonight was carving that scar. An invisible choice stood at the edge of the table, to seize power or to surrender it and kneel. Which do you think is closer to God, sitting at the head or lifting your brother's burden onto your own shoulders? The wind struck the window once more. The flames trembled. Jesus rose and walked around the table, resting his hand gently on each shoulder in turn. That touch would outlive his words. Then he turned toward the door. The time had come, As he descended the wooden stairs, his footsteps echoed against the stone courtyard. Outside, the night swallowed everything the room had held. Those left behind saw their own fragility reflected in one another's eyes. The mark on the rim of the cup deepened. By morning, that mark would become a reminder. Across the city, near the temple courts, a few torches flared. The rustle of linen brushed against the cold ring of metal. A scribe pressed a single word into wax: 30. Another table was being set in the night, a table of numbers, prices and bargains. Soon the shadows would speak in the language of stone and silver. The night was fading slowly in the temple courtyard. The flickering oil lamps cast restless shadows on the stone walls. At the center stood a table covered with parchments, wax seals, and most of all silver coins. Numbers were whispered, words cut like blades. Everyone present knew this table was not just a market for money, but for souls. When Judas entered, the scholars and priests lifted their eyes. Their gaze pulled him into a game already set in motion. At the corners of their lips lingered a sly curve, and their hands betrayed impatience. With his arrival, the silence grew heavier. Tonight an agreement would be sealed, one that would shape the course of history. "What will you give me for him?" they asked. Judas's lips cracked, his voice falling like dry stone. "What will you give me?" A priest pressed a wax seal, another dropped coins onto the table from a pouch. The sharp clink of metal echoed through the courtyard. 30 pieces of silver. Not just coins, weight enough to bend the path of a man's heart. Judas's eyes fixed on the pouch. A storm churned within him, duty, fear, longing for hope. As he reached out, it wasn't the coins that trembled beneath his fingertips, but an unseen thread tied deep into his soul. When the purse settled into his palm, the emptiness inside him seemed filled, and yet at once it grew deeper still. The gleam in the priest's eyes was the satisfaction of hunters closing a trap. "When the time comes, you will give the signal," they said. Judas nodded, his lips pressed thin. He barely heard his own voice. Only the cold ringing of silver filled his ears. Each coin struck like a nail against his heart. That night in the temple was more than a transaction. It carved the sharpest line of betrayal into human history. 30 silver pieces became a question echoing across the ages. What is the value of a soul? The next day, Jerusalem's streets swelled with the noise of the market. The scent of spices hung thick in the air. Camel bells rang out. Judas moved among the crowd, his shoulders bent beneath an invisible weight. The purse was still with him, dragging at his steps. While merchants argued and buyers haggled, the sound of silver clinking never left his ears. He stopped in a corner, watching the crowd. Children darted between stalls. Mothers called out. Traders shouted their prices. Judas stood apart, as if behind a veil of mist. A whisper escaped his lips, a confession to his own conscience. "What have I done? Where will this path lead?" At that moment, he caught a stare in the crowd. One of the priests from the temple fixed his eyes on him for the briefest instant. In that look was a warning. There was no turning back. Judas turned his head and walked on. With every step, the echo grew louder in his mind. 30 pieces of silver, 30 pieces of silver. In the cool silence of night, Judas stood once more in the arched passageway of the temple courtyard. The pouch in his pocket was heavy, yet its weight was not metal. The faint rattle of the coins did not sound like a prayer, but like a sentence. A guard and an attendant of the high priest drew near. "Do you know the place?" asked the attendant. "It must be quiet, far from the crowd. We don't want witnesses." Judas lifted his head. For a moment hesitation froze in his eyes, then he concealed it. "He prays in the olive grove," he said. "At night he is there. It's quiet. I'll point him out." The attendant raised the torch closer. "The signal must be clear. No mistakes. I'll greet him when I approach," Judas replied. "A greeting isn't enough," the man said sharply. "We can't risk confusion in the dark." A short, certain sign. Judas lowered his gaze. The words caught in his throat, then slipped out. "I'll kiss him." The passageway seemed to shudder with invisible thunder. Silence followed. The guard looked down and said coldly, "All right. Whatever you plan to do, do it quickly." Judas slipped the pouch deeper into his robe. As he descended the steps, the torches traced golden lines across the stone. Each flicker felt like a boundary between loyalty and surrender. He walked toward the marketplace. The shops were shuttered, the smell of spices still clinging to the walls. In one corner, a potter's broken jars lay scattered. He stared at a cracked vessel. "Is that what happened to me?" A fracture beginning on the outside, cutting its way inward. A child ran past, clutching half a piece of flatbread. For a fleeting moment, the boy's glance made Judas forget the weight of the silver. He wanted to help, but when his hand touched the purse, he pulled back. Everything this money touches becomes unclean. At the edge of the city where the quarries ended, the wind stirred the dry grass. In his mind he saw a terrifying vision, a field stained with blood. He turned his head away, but the image stayed with him. He bent over a fountain and washed his face. The water brought no comfort, only a deeper chill. Once a man hears his decision in his own voice, he cannot silence it again. He almost untied the purse to scatter the coins, but his hand froze. The voice inside demanded something else now, the bitter truth that there was no way back. He brushed his fingers across a line carved in a doorway. Man twists what he thinks is straight with the curve hidden in his own heart. The attendant returned. Don't let the night stretch on. The priests are waiting. It must be done before dawn. I will finish it, Judas said. You'll take him when he's alone. No one else will be harmed. The attendant gave a short laugh. No night ends the same as it begins. Judas said nothing. Inside him, a silent weighing took place. Whom am I delivering, him or myself? Tell me, when does a choice become final? When silver enters the purse, or when it enters the heart? As night deepened, Judas's steps grew heavier, each one echoing like a burden he could not set down. The murmur of the streets seemed to magnify the pounding in his chest. At every corner, memories rose unbidden, moments when he walked beside Jesus, when the sick were lifted and healed, when crowds found peace in his voice. Yet now those same roads carried the weight of betrayal. In a square, beggars stretched out their hands. When their eyes turned to Judas, the silver in his purse grew heavier still. He clenched his fists inside his cloak. How could those coins feel both priceless and worthless at the same time? A beggar's whisper cut the night. A crumb of bread, sir. Judas quickened his pace. Sometimes the smallest plea weighs more than the harshest accusation. At the city gates, guards stood waiting. Their commander fixed a sharp gaze on him. Is everything ready? Ready, Judas answered, though the voice that left his lips sounded like a stranger's. The commander bowed slightly. Then we move when you give the signal. Judas said nothing. Only one voice echoed in his mind, Jesus' words, whoever wants to follow me must also carry his cross. Yet tonight, the burden on Judas's back felt heavier than any cross, the weight of his own choice. The gates opened. The wind cut cold as the road to the Mount of Olives stretched before them, silvered by the moonlight. Each step pulled him deeper into confusion. Perhaps this is God's plan, he thought. But if it is, why does my heart feel so hollow? By the roadside, a woman stumbled, her jar shattering as water spilled across the stone. Judas paused, staring at the crack. Is this what I've become? Whole on the outside, broken within. The soldiers pressed forward. One guard smirked. Will we recognize him? You will, Judas replied. Yet even those words rang empty. The road narrowed. The olive trees loomed, shadows thickening in the silence. Judas battled the voice inside. Can't you still turn back? But a colder whisper answered, it's too late. There is no turning back. From the grove came the scent of earth and prayer, the sound of Jesus' voice carried on the wind. Each word deepened the void inside Judas. And in that moment he understood. The true betrayal was not in the silver, but in the fracture already spreading through his own heart. The night closed with questions that offered no answers. The road between temple and grove was no longer mere stone. It had become the fabric of destiny. Betrayal had taken shape, but its mystery remained veiled in the shadows. And so we step closer to the question that lingers for all, the secret within betrayal, God's plan or Satan's game. As night deepened beyond Jerusalem's walls, two voices battled within Judas's mind. On one side were the cold, unyielding stares of the priests. On the other, the words he had once heard at Jesus' feet. One voice promised him, bring him to us, and you will have silver. The other whispered, piercing his heart, my friend, is this why you came? These voices echoed like two rival kingdoms, the light of God against the shadow of Satan. The words from the temple courtyard still haunted him. Each time Judas touched the pouch at his side, he thought it might quiet the emptiness inside. But every touch only pulled him deeper into an abyss. He asked himself, was this truly my choice, or had it already been written? Was betrayal an act of free will, or a step laid out in an ancient plan? In the distance, a rooster crowed. Dawn had not yet come, but the night carried the weight of morning. Judas lifted his eyes to the sky. The stars gave no answer. In their silence, he heard his own question echo back. If this is part of God's plan, why is there so much pain inside me? If it isn't, why does this path feel so inevitable? Elsewhere in the city, the disciples wrestled with their own fears. Peter's bold vow still rang in their ears. I will never deny you. Yet Jesus' gaze had already revealed the frailty of such a promise. Thomas with his quiet doubts, Matthew with trembling hands, Simon with hope tangled in anger, all were caught in an unseen web. For betrayal did not belong to one man alone. Its shadow lay across every heart. As Judas walked through the streets, that shadow pressed in on him. A whisper as cold as the temple stones crept into his ear. You were chosen. It is your destiny. But another voice collided with it, recalling Jesus' words, one of you will betray me. Was being chosen a sacred privilege or a crushing curse? He stopped at a corner where shards of broken pottery lay. He remembered the potter's work. A cracked vessel cannot hold water, just as a broken heart cannot hold light. Perhaps I was broken from the beginning, he thought. But another question followed close behind. What if God chose me for this very brokenness? The thought chilled him, for if that were true, then betrayal was not his alone. It was bound into heaven's design. As the night wore on, the knot in Judas's mind tightened. He felt neither entirely guilty nor entirely innocent. He was no longer just a man walking the narrow streets of Jerusalem. He had become a figure burdened with humanity's oldest question. Do we choose our path, or has it already been chosen for us? And within the betrayal lay the greatest secret of all. The journey that began with a kiss had become an unseen battlefield, where free will and destiny collided. Judas's steps grew heavier. With each one he felt himself pulled between God's plan and the schemes of darkness. At the edge of the pool of Siloam, he listened to the sound of water striking stone. Beneath the night sky, even the rippling waves seemed to speak. Flow, he whispered, a flow that never stops. Perhaps life was like that too. What we called free will was only a river forced to follow its bed. Memories from his childhood broke through. A boy walking dusty roads in Iscariot, safe in his mother's arms. The distance between that innocence and the shadow he now carried felt less like years and more like an abyss. Where did I go wrong, he wondered. Was it a single misstep that set this in motion, or was the path chosen long before he was born? He closed his eyes and saw again the gaze of Jesus. A look that knew everything, exposed every weakness, yet still touched with love. He chose me, Judas whispered. He knew what I would do. The thought circled endlessly. If Jesus knew all things, then he knew this betrayal as well. So was it Judas's own sin, or a thread in a divine design? A sudden phrase echoed in his mind. He who clings to darkness will lose the light. Was it his own thought, or a voice from beyond? He shuddered. He could no longer tell what rose from within his heart, and what was whispered from outside. He lingered by the water, dipping his fingers into the pool and pressing its coolness against his face. If this is destiny, he thought, why does my heart resist? The ripples gave no answer. Inside him the conflict grew, waves breaking against each other with deafening force. Footsteps stirred behind him. A figure approached unseen in the dark, but its voice was clear. Sometimes what you call destiny is only the echo of your choices. Judas held his breath. The words struck deep, tightening the knot in his soul. As Jerusalem's night pressed down, the same question bound him again. If this is betrayal, why does heaven stay silent? If this is God's plan, why does it break my heart? He turned toward the Mount of Olives, climbing slowly beneath the trembling silver leaves. Each step multiplied his questions. In his hand, the purse of coins rattled, the sound of conflict whispering both triumph and ruin. He stopped, then hurled the purse to the ground. Silver scattered in the moonlight. Judas fell to his knees, face buried in his hands. If this is my choice, why does it cut so deep? If this is God's will, why does the darkness weigh so heavy? Tears dropped onto stone, each one adding to the burden inside him. The silence thickened into a haunting whisper. Your name will be remembered for centuries as traitor. The words rose from within, and he trembled. Was he walking in fate's shadow or trapped in the echo of his own mistake? He did not know. All he knew was that each step forward could never be taken back. He lifted his head. The moon slipped behind the clouds. God, he prayed softly, save me from this road, or at least show me why I was chosen. But the heavens gave no reply. That silence only deepened the storm within. Judas rose and drew a long breath. He left the coins where they lay, for he knew now it was never about the silver. It was about the breaking of his own soul. As he moved through the shadows of the olive trees, one question pressed against his thoughts. Do we truly choose our own path, or are we simply walking the lines of a story already written? Leaving Siloam, night fell quickly over the narrow streets. The branches of the olive trees stretched their shadows across the stone walls, and every whisper seemed to echo louder in the silence. Judas slipped his fingers over the pouch at his side. The weight of the silver felt heavier than metal. It pressed against his chest like a stone on his heart. If this is the right thing, why does it hurt so deeply? He wondered. The only reply was the dry rustle of leaves brushing against one another in the wind. He did not turn toward the upper road leading to the temple, but instead followed the path descending into Gethsemane. He knew every step by heart. He had walked this way many times with the others. Here, under the shelter of the trees, Jesus prayed through the night while they waited in silence. "One of you will betray me," he had said at the table. The words lay there like a blade, no one daring to lift them. Each disciple had whispered, "Is it I, Lord?" And the silence afterward carried the weight of their fear. When Judas reached the edge of the grove, he hesitated. The moon spilled pale light across the stones. Inside him, two voices clashed again. One recalled the certainty promised by the priests: order, tradition, unshaken authority. The other carried the quiet pull of Jesus' gaze, a call that judged no one, a word that lingered: "My friend." That word trembled in his chest. When friendship and betrayal came from the same lips, which one was true? He lingered by the water's edge, dipping his fingers into the stream and feeling its coolness on his skin. If this path is truly my destiny, he thought, then why does my heart still resist? He searched the ripples for an answer, but none came. The turmoil inside him swelled like waves colliding in a storm. The sudden sound of footsteps behind him made him start. A figure approached, face hidden in shadow. Judas could not see him, but the voice carried clearly, "Sometimes what you call destiny is only the echo of your own choices." Judas held his breath. He could not see the speaker, but those words sank deep into him, tightening the knot inside his soul. As the night deepened over Jerusalem, Judas wrestled with the same haunting question: if this is betrayal, why do the heavens remain silent? And if it is part of a divine plan, why does my heart ache so fiercely? His steps were heavy as he moved toward the slope of the Mount of Olives. Moonlight filtered through the olive branches, casting trembling shadows across the ground. Each step only multiplied the questions pressing against his mind. In his hand he clutched the small purse of silver, the coins clinking with every movement. Their metallic ring echoed the conflict within him, whispering both triumph and ruin. He stopped suddenly and hurled the purse to the ground. Silver spilled across the stones, glittering in the pale light. Judas collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands. If this is the path I've chosen, why does it hurt so deeply? If this is God's will, why does the darkness feel so heavy? Tears streamed down his face, each drop striking the earth like the weight of the questions consuming him. Then from within the silence a voice rose, a whisper heavy as iron. "Your name will be remembered for centuries as a traitor." The words came from the depths of his own soul, and Judas shuddered. Was he walking under the shadow of destiny or trapped in the echo of his own failure? He could not tell. All he knew was that every step forward left no way back. He lifted his gaze toward the sky, but the moon slipped behind the clouds. "God," he whispered, "deliver me from this path, or at least show me why I was chosen." But the heavens remained still, and their silence only fueled the storm raging inside him. Slowly Judas rose and drew in a long breath. He did not reach for the coins. In that moment he knew it was never about the silver. It was about the fragility of his own soul. As he walked deeper among the shadows of the olive trees, one question rang through his mind. Do we truly choose our path, or do we simply walk out the lines of a story already written? When he left Siloam, the night closed over the narrow streets. The shadows stretched along the stone walls, every rustle of leaves, every faint whisper magnified. His fingers brushed the pouch at his side, feeling the weight of silver like a stone pressing on his chest. If this is right, why does it feel so wrong inside? There was no reply, only the dry rasp of the wind pushing the olive branches together. He turned not toward the temple's upper road, but down the path that led to Gethsemane. He knew the way well in the dark. He had walked it many times with the others. Here Jesus often prayed, while they waited in silence. At the table the words had been spoken, "One of you will betray me." They had lain across the room like a blade. No one dared touch it. "Is it I, Lord?" they had asked, their eyes searching, their voices breaking. Now as Judas neared the edge of the olive grove, he stopped once more. Moonlight scattered in broken patches across the stones. Two voices warred within him. One echoed the certainty of the priests, tradition upheld, authority unshaken. The other sounded like Jesus' silent call, a voice that judged nothing, yet invited everything. "My friend." The word reverberated in his chest. When both betrayal and friendship fall from the same lips, which one speaks the truth? The night slowly descended over the hills of Jerusalem. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the trees stood as silent witnesses to one of the greatest struggles in human history. Was this the design of God, or the work of the enemy? The answer has never been certain. But on that night, a betrayal sealed with a kiss opened the door to an endless debate that still lingers. As silence spread through the city, the stone streets of Jerusalem carried the echo of treachery. Within Judas, the knot of doubt only tightened. Under the pale moonlight, the narrow paths seemed to blur the line between hope and pride. And with each step, he drew closer to the deepest conflict of his soul. What awaited him was not only his own fate, but the reflection of humanity's oldest and most haunting question. What if I told you that Judas was defined not only by betrayal, but by the storm within his mind? The choices he made that night shaped not just the fate of Jesus, but also humanity's most haunting question. Do we fall by our own will, or are we bound to become instruments in God's design? Judas's prison was not the 30 silver coins in his hand, but the two voices warring in his heart. One was the gentle voice of Jesus, "My friend." The other, the promises of order and authority whispered by the priests. Trapped between mercy and power, he made a choice that would alter the course of history. Was it greed that led him into darkness, or was it the fear that rose in him when God seemed silent? That night his mind swayed between hope and pride, between the thought that forgiveness was still possible and the crushing weight of a sin too heavy to be redeemed. History remembers the silver and the kiss, but the silence between the lines reveals more. Judas was broken within himself. The deepest battle was not over coins, but in the shadows of his own soul. So I ask you, what is more terrifying, the hands that gave Jesus to his enemies, or a heart so hardened by pride that it could no longer trust God's forgiveness? The struggle inside Judas was not just his own. The words of the priest still echoed in his ears. If order is not kept, chaos will consume the people. Their logic seemed convincing. Yet every glance from Jesus, filled with mercy, tore that logic apart. Two worlds clashed within him, God's silent plan and the fragile systems built by men. One memory struck him like a blade. At the table, as Jesus broke the bread and said, "This is my body," Judas felt his heart pierced. And now those same hands he had betrayed to his enemies. The question burned within him. Had he fulfilled God's plan, or simply surrendered to his own desires? Perhaps no person could carry such a role alone. Perhaps Judas only stepped onto a path already laid before him, unable to tell where his will ended and God's will began. That uncertainty was his torment. For when someone believes their sin is beyond forgiveness, the weight of that belief is heavier than the sin itself. This was Judas's greatest battle, caught between what he had done and God's silence. The moon hung above him like a witness, its light dividing hope and pride with a blade sharper than any knife. And as dawn drew near, his heart grew tighter. Only his breath and the distant crowing of roosters broke the silence. Each crowing shook him, reminding him of Peter's coming denial. "I am no different," he thought. "They too will stumble in fear. But my fall, mine will be deeper. Mine will be beyond return." The ground beneath his feet felt heavy, each step harder than the last. Then another image rose from deep within his heart, Jesus' eyes calm and unshaken. It wasn't the look of someone betrayed, but of one who already knew everything. That gaze burned Judas and drew him in at the same time. If Jesus had known all along, why had he chosen him? Why call him my friend? The questions multiplied in his mind, swelling like an avalanche. Judas pressed his back against the trunk of a tree. His hands trembled, sweat dripping from his brow onto the soil. A troubling thought emerged. What if God's plan required him to play this role? If so, was betrayal not treachery at all, but duty? For a moment the weight on his shoulders seemed lighter, yet at once it turned into a heavier chain. Because if this was duty, why did his heart feel crushed beneath guilt? That night the torment drove him to the edge of a cliff within his soul. On one side he found comfort in believing he was serving the divine plan. On the other, he could not escape the sting of his own will, the choice that betrayed his master. By dawn, this struggle sharpened into a single question, standing between hope and pride. Where can a soul truly find rest? As light broke over the horizon, memories returned like a curtain pulled back before his eyes. Judas saw again the day he first met Jesus. The look Jesus gave him through the crowd seemed to pierce into the darkest chamber of his heart. When he heard the words, "Follow me," it wasn't faith that stirred him, but curiosity. Perhaps that was why the stones along his path had always felt different. His steps had been marked not by trust, but by questions, and those questions had led him here. A sharp ache pierced him. He weighed his unrest against the faith of the others. Peter burned with devotion. John spoke the language of love. Matthew had cast off the shame of his old life. But Judas, a rift had always lived in his heart. He never trusted fully, never surrendered completely. And now that rift had widened into an abyss. As the moonlight faded, a voice rose from deep within him. God forgives. For a moment it flickered like a spark of hope. But then, just as quickly, a darker shadow smothered it. But not you. Your sin is beyond forgiveness. This was the torment gnawing at Judas's heart. The weight of a soul caught between hope and pride, insisting its own sin could never be redeemed. He fell to his knees. Tears streamed down his face, each drop striking the ground as if echoing his remorse. Yet even in that remorse, pride lingered. For to believe that some sins cannot be forgiven, is that not in itself a denial of God's mercy? This was Judas's true downfall. Long before the betrayal, he already believed he was beyond grace. As dawn touched the walls of Jerusalem, Judas's inner battle raged on. In that struggle, a question began to form, not just for him but for all humanity. Was the true destruction the betrayal itself, or the refusal to believe in God's mercy? The city slowly awakened. Gates creaked open, merchants prepared their stalls, and people greeted the morning in peace. Seeing their calm faces cut Judas even deeper. For while they lived unaware, he had sealed his fate and sparked a question that would echo through history in a single night. He paused by a well. Staring into the water, he saw his reflection, eyes bloodshot, skin pale, lips trembling. From the depths of his chest he whispered, half in anguish, half in disbelief, "Who am I? A traitor or a chosen instrument?" The rippling water blurred his reflection, but the question remained, heavy in the air. Then from the crowd he caught a whisper that pierced him. A few of Jesus' disciples were speaking. The Lord always shared his table with him. How could he choose such a path? Their words struck harder than the silver ever had. For now Judas was not only condemned by his own conscience, but cursed by the eyes of his brothers. Walking beneath the city walls, another thought clawed at him. If this was truly part of God's plan, why did he feel so utterly alone? And if it was only his choice, why was the weight so unbearable? Between these questions, Judas's spirit swayed on the razor's edge, caught between hope and despair, pride and surrender. Jerusalem stirred to life, but the storm within him only grew louder. And in that silence, one truth rang clear: no one can see God's mercy unless he first believes he can be forgiven. Thus, the struggle in Judas's mind did not complete his story, it deepened it. A depth that still reaches through the centuries into the pages of Scripture, where his place remains a mystery that refuses to fade, and one that will forever haunt the story of faith. As Jerusalem awoke that morning, the sky burned red, casting a heavy curtain of light across the stone streets. The echoes of the night before still lingered. Whispers from Gethsemane now rippled through the bustling marketplaces. As Jesus, hands bound, was dragged away by the guards, one name spread from the lips of the 12 to the alleys of the city: Judas. From this moment on, the canonical Gospels attach a single title to him: Traitor. In Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, his story is sealed in betrayal. It is not just a description, but a scar etched into the memory of time. Matthew records Judas exchanging his Lord for 30 pieces of silver. Mark highlights the kiss, the chosen signal that delivered the Master into the hands of his enemies. Luke writes that Satan entered his heart. John is the harshest, calling Judas a thief and claiming the emptiness was within him from the beginning. 4 voices, yet one portrait, a friendship shattered by betrayal. But when these accounts are read side by side, questions rise. Was greed alone enough to drive him to this? Or was there a deeper fracture hidden beneath the surface? Matthew points to the weight of the coins, Luke to the whisper of Satan, John to an emptiness that had long taken root. Perhaps Judas's downfall was not a single choice made in one night, but a shadow that had been growing within him all along. That morning, rumors spread through Jerusalem like wildfire. One of them sold him, people whispered. The closest among the 12 betrayed him. In the minds of the people, Judas was no longer just a name, he was a warning. For betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from a friend. And Judas's name would forever be remembered as the mark of that wound. Was I chosen, or did I choose? If this was fate, why does my heart feel so heavy? And if it was my choice, why is there no way back? The language of the canonical Gospels never questions Judas. For them, the betrayal is simple, final. Yet when we look closer, we see not just a man, but the most fragile crack in the human soul. Because all of us wrestle between loyalty and fear, between hope and pride. Judas is not only the face of betrayal, he is the mirror of humanity's greatest trial. Which do you think is harder to forgive, the act of betrayal or the pride that refuses to believe in God's forgiveness? As the morning light struck the stone walls of Jerusalem, Judas's name was sealed into sacred history. His name became a warning, a lesson carried through generations. And yet the conflict within him still echoes between the lines, reaching beyond the written words. When Jesus was dragged toward the Roman governor's palace, the crowd grew louder, and Judas's name rose from whispers to condemnation. Women in the market cursed his name to warn their children. Old men shook their heads, saying, "The fate of those who betray their friends is darkness." Every corner of Jerusalem's stone streets rang with the sound of his name. Judas, meanwhile, vanished into silence. The pages of Scripture do not record his thoughts, but we can almost hear them echoing through the void. The guilt he carried was already eating at his heart, even as Jesus was taken from his hands. For betrayal is never just an act, it is a wound carved into the depths of the soul. To the friends with whom he once shared bread, Judas had become nothing but a scar. Imagine Peter's eyes burning with anger, or John turning away in sorrow. Judas had betrayed not only Jesus, but the sacred bond of brotherhood. Betrayal was not just handing the rabbi to his enemies, it was selling the years they had walked together, the bread they had broken, the prayers they had whispered side by side. And perhaps the most painful thing of all was the silence within Judas himself. Once he had answered Jesus' call to follow me. He had seen miracles with his own eyes, had walked beside him through days witnessed by crowds. But now, every memory became a shadow clawing at his heart. In those hours, the echo of footsteps on Jerusalem's stone streets was like a hollow bell, tolling the emptiness inside him. While the people argued over Jesus' fate and cursed Judas's name, he slipped unseen through the crowd, eyes lowered, ears filled with the noise of his own conscience. The silence within him weighed far more than the noise outside. The portrait drawn by Scripture was clear, he was a traitor, yet the storm in Judas's mind never stilled. The void left by betrayal was not only the loss of his teacher, but the ruin of his very self. In his self-condemnation, a single question rose in his heart. Could the plan have unfolded without me? That thought dragged him deeper into fear on one side, pride on the other. Among the people, his name lingered as a curse. In the pages of Scripture, it remained sealed. In the hearts of his companions, it endured as a wound. Yet the deepest wound lay within himself. With every step, that final look in Jesus' eyes returned to him, etched into his mind like a mark that would never fade. It was a look filled more with mercy than judgment. And perhaps that was why the most unbearable thought was not condemnation, but the possibility of forgiveness. Forgiveness, that was the heaviest thought echoing in Judas's heart. Because forgiveness meant facing what he had done, and he could not find the strength to endure that reckoning. As morning advanced and the temple courtyard filled with people, Judas's steps grew hurried. The clinking of the silver coins in his pouch echoed the rhythm of his rising guilt. His fingers trembled as he climbed the steps. The same hands gripping the pouch had once reached across the same table. At the doorway he stopped, then slipped inside like a shadow. The priest's eyes were brief, sharp, condemning. "I have sinned," Judas said, his voice breaking. "I have betrayed innocent blood." One of the officials only shrugged. "What is that to us? That is your concern." Judas's eyes flickered, as if the last leaf of hope within him had fallen. He opened the pouch. The 30 silver coins burned in his hands like fire. Then he hurled them across the sacred floor. The silver scattered across the stone like a sudden storm, the sound cutting through the temple's heavy silence. The priests exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered, "This is blood money. It cannot be placed in the treasury." Those words, cloaked in the letter of the law, soothed only their calculations, not their conscience. Their minds were occupied with their fears, their power, and the restless festival crowd. None dared touch the silver. In that moment, it seemed even the stones of the temple were eyes fixed upon Judas. When he stumbled outside, the sun had risen. Shadows shortened, but the darkness within him deepened. His steps carried him to the thickets, to the desolate slopes beyond the city walls. The wind stirred the dry grass, but his mind repeated the same confession: "I have betrayed innocent blood." And then another question rose within him, sharper, quieter: is there any way back? On one side of the canonical story, the knot is tied here. Judas climbs a tree, fastens a rope to a branch, and ends his life with his own hands. On another, he stumbles on a dark hillside, his body tumbling down the rocks, torn apart by the fall. Matthew describes the final weight of judgment. Acts tells of the dreadful silence of a body striking the stones. Two windows onto the same fate, one marked by the shadow of the rope, the other by the hardness of the earth. Meanwhile, in the city, another reckoning unfolded. The priests gathered the scattered silver and murmured among themselves, "We cannot put this into the treasury. It is blood money," they said. So they used it to buy a potter's field, a place for burying strangers. From that day, the land carried an Aramaic name, Hakeldama, field of blood. Stones do not speak, but names endure. The name of a field can whisper a man's story for generations. Children are born, the old pass away, but the name continues to echo through the winds of Jerusalem. When the cold weight of silver meets the warmth of blood, the land remembers. The Gospels do not record what passed through Judas's heart. They leave us only fragments. Yet those fragments are enough. Guilt divides the soul into two paths, one leading to repentance, the other to despair. In one, the head is lifted, in the other, the eyes close forever. Which chain do you think is heavier, confessing guilt while waiting for mercy, or turning away from mercy itself? The clatter of silver faded long ago. The temple courtyard filled again with crowds, merchants calling out in their familiar rhythm. But from that day forward, every wind sweeping across Hakeldama carried more than dust. It carried the truth that betrayal does not bloom in a single night, but grows slowly in the deep cracks of the human heart. And so the canonical story frames the portrait of Judas, a man who rose from among the chosen, shared bread at the table, and then stepped out into the deepest shadows. Yet a portrait is only one perspective. The same face in another light, under another shadow, can appear utterly different. So let us lean into this silence. Why do two accounts of the same event draw such different pictures of destiny? Are they contradictions, or two ways of revealing a larger truth still speaking to us? As we ask this question, we must hold close the framework of the canonical texts, for everything that follows will be read in their light. And after these stark lines of scripture, we turn to the shadows of history. For in the apocryphal and forbidden writings, another image of Judas takes shape, one that whispers of secrets and dares to challenge the portrait we thought we knew. As the echoes of church bells faded against the stone walls of Jerusalem, a question lingered in the shadows for centuries. If one disciple was chosen to carry God's most hidden mystery, why was that burden given to Judas? The canonical Gospels declared him a traitor. Yet manuscripts concealed for ages painted a very different picture. A man not cursed but weighed down with a sacred burden. The Gospel of Judas, one of the most striking texts in the Gnostic tradition, cast his name in a new light. Here Judas was the disciple who grasped Jesus' secrets most deeply. His betrayal was not simple treachery, but a task carried out at the very request of the Messiah. In this telling, Judas became the key to Jesus' release from the physical world. The cross became the doorway to a liberation beyond suffering, but such a perspective was never voiced from the church pulpits. It redefined the meaning of betrayal itself. What if betrayal was in its deepest sense an act of obedience to God's will? This idea threatened the order preserved for centuries. And so Judas's name was cursed, and the texts that spoke differently of him were banned. Yet one question refuses to fade. If Judas was nothing more than a common traitor, why did Jesus choose him? Why break bread with him at the table? Why call him my friend? The apocryphal whispers suggest a haunting answer. Judas carried the heaviest role. He was the one who walked the darkest road in God's plan. Perhaps Judas himself wrestled with the question countless times, am I a traitor or a chosen servant? And that question becomes humanity's oldest dilemma. Where does free will end, and where does divine destiny begin? The Gnostic vision paints Judas as a symbol of sacrifice, the man who accepted the most painful role so the plan could unfold, even at the cost of his name being cursed forever. A shocking thought, that betrayal might stand closer to obedience than we ever imagined. Yet the portrait in the canonical Gospels still endures, a man crushed by regret, ending his own life. Side by side, these two images reveal not just a figure of history, but one of the deepest struggles within the human soul. The fragments that survive from those days are more than theology. They are a battlefield. On one side, the authority of the Church. On the other, the whispers of hidden traditions. On one side, the cursed image of a traitor. On the other, a chosen one said to bear the heaviest burden in the divine plan. And here the question turns to you, the listener. If what we call betrayal was in fact a duty, how firm is the line between right and wrong in our own lives? How many times have choices that looked like failure from the outside carried a greater purpose we could not yet see? The debate over Judas does not only belong to him, it reflects the conflict within us all. Because sooner or later we face the same haunting question: are we following the divine plan, or are we simply chasing our own desires? Picture a flickering oil lamp in a dusty chamber, two hands slowly rolling up a fragile scroll. The crack of the seal as it closed echoed like a final verdict, a barrier between silence and revelation. Over centuries, some words were read in whispers, others never spoken at all, for a single line could restore a man's name or condemn him to eternal darkness. And Judas's name has always hung between those two fates. In apocryphal pages, Judas is never ignored. On the contrary, the gaze often falls directly on him. In his conversations with Jesus, as those texts suggest, there is a rawness others never heard. A teacher looks into the eyes of a chosen student and seems to say, "You will carry the burden that no one else can bear." If these words were true, they did not just change history, they reshaped the very meaning of betrayal. For then it was not about greed or gain, but about accepting a role no one else dared to take. In the canonical Gospels, the picture is sharper. The kiss, the soldiers, the judgment at dawn. Judas appears etched in regret and separation. Yet in the Apocrypha, his face is shaded differently, lit from below, torn between fear and resolve, yet still determined enough to finish what had begun. The same man, the same night, two portraits, one preached from pulpits, the other whispered in margins. This tension is not only a question of history, it is the human struggle itself between faith and reason, fear and obedience, free will and divine destiny. On one side, justice that condemns betrayal in a single word. On the other, the unsettling possibility that God's plan stretches far beyond what we can grasp. And if that plan was the salvation sung for centuries beneath temple domes, who then would carry the weight of its darkest corner? If we could hear the voice inside Judas, it might whisper, "Why did you choose me?" Can the pride of being chosen and the pain of its cost live in the same heart? If I were not here, would this night still happen? No line gives a final answer. The gaps the texts leave are like cracks in the human soul. Through those cracks seep greed, fear, and sometimes the sharp edge of obedience. The stern refusals of the Church Fathers were more than a quarrel over words. They were the work of guarding a flock. A different reading of a single line can reshape a conscience. To see Judas in another light is not a casual opinion. It shifts the weight of every word. So some pages were rolled tight, some pages hidden, some sentences travel not in a shout, but in a breath. Still, this remains: in the night a kiss in a garden, by morning a verdict. These are the bones. The flesh is the meaning we give them. Do we see betrayal as a bargain, or as a cost no one wishes to bear? This dilemma visits not only the heart of Judas, but the heart of every believer. The line between wrong and right is thin as paper. A single sentence, a single intention, a single glance can split it. Now look with care at the bridge between the texts. At one end, the tragedy of a man who repented and stepped away. At the other, the burden carried by a disciple who served a secret. Between them lies a silence, unfilled for 1,000 years. We lean over that silence, not with our own noise, but with the whispers of the writings that witnessed that night. A short, sharp question: which weighs more, the price of a kiss, or the burden of choosing the path that ends in that kiss? We will not answer yet. Those who answer too quickly often miss half the story. As the night deepened, the garden's hush became a blanket, carrying history's heaviest questions. Forbidden texts speak of quiet words that slipped into that hush. When Jesus' eyes met Judas's, they say, a message passed that others could not hear: "You will bear the role all will curse." Yet remember, this too is the Father's will. If such words were truly spoken, imagine the storm that broke in Judas's heart. It began with a kiss and rose into a wind that still roars in the conscience of the ages. The canonical Gospels record the night as betrayal. The Apocrypha hint at a final exchange between teacher and student. On one side, a disciple torn by fear and hesitation. On the other, a teacher who accepts the weight of destiny in silence. Jesus' gaze touched Judas's deepest wound. Was it the pride of being chosen, or the cost of being cursed? Perhaps both were true at once. At this moment, the question becomes piercing. If Judas was truly carrying out a mission, how do we define betrayal? Was it an act of sacrifice, or humanity's darkest deed? The answer to that question touches not only the past, but also our own lives. For each of us may one day face a choice that seems wrong, yet serves a higher purpose. And in those moments, what holds greater weight, blind loyalty to obedience, or the courage to choose what seems right? The language of the apocryphal texts places this very test before our eyes. Judas carried out his teacher's words, even though it cost him a name cursed for all eternity. That story unsettles the mind and presses against the conscience. We condemn betrayal easily, but to accept that a sacrifice might wear the mask of betrayal is far harder. Perhaps that is why these texts were locked away on the dusty shelves of history, whispered only in secret. But even whispers can be powerful. Every word spoken in the garden that night carried the weight of a secret, destined to echo for 1,000 years. And today we lean in, straining to hear that echo. When dawn broke over Jerusalem's stone streets, the night's whispers had not yet faded. On one side marched the soldiers' footsteps, on the other rose the murmur of forbidden words, like shadows colliding with light. It was as though two worlds overlapped. The Judas of the canonical Gospels clashed with the shadowed figure in the apocryphal texts, both inhabiting the same body. That conflict was not only the struggle of one man, but a reflection carved into the conscience of humanity itself. The words ascribed to Jesus in those hidden writings are haunting. They will curse you, but you will be with me. If those words were ever truly spoken, they mark one of history's deepest ironies, for in them Judas becomes both traitor and friend. A traitor because he delivers his master, a friend because he fulfills his wish. That paradox has remained a knot no hand has been able to untie for centuries. The teachings of the Church Fathers tried to cut through it with one stroke. Judas is a traitor, end of story. Yet behind that final period lie forbidden sentences, torn out pages, burned manuscripts. And that silence itself gave birth to an even louder echo. The contradictions of the human soul can never truly be silenced. Return to that moment in the garden. On one side, the flicker of torches, on the other, the cold glow of the moon. How quickly did Judas's heart race as the soldiers drew near? If this was only betrayal, why did tears fill his eyes? If it was a duty, why did the emptiness after the kiss feel unbearable? These questions are not just history, they are a mirror held up to our own conscience, because often we too are caught between two voices, one whispering, "This is wrong," and another urging, "But maybe it serves a greater purpose." To walk between those voices is the struggle of every human life, beyond the story of Judas. Perhaps that is why his name is still spoken, because his conflict echoes the war within us all. And so the question becomes clear: what is harder to forgive? The betrayal of a friend, or embracing the darkness within God's plan? The answer to this dilemma waits in the lines ahead. As dawn broke and the stone walls of Jerusalem glowed crimson, Judas's name had already become more than a man. It had become a condition of the soul. In the apocryphal writings, his eyes are drawn differently, weary, fractured, yet strangely resolute. It is as if he bore the weight of both curse and calling at once. That face is absent in the official accounts of the Church, where only betrayal casts its shadow. Yet in the forbidden text behind that face lies not only pain but surrender. Here the true conflict takes shape: loyalty to God's plan, or the shame of betraying a friend. Judas's tears carry two meanings. On one side, drops of regret; on the other, the burden of a choice made with full knowledge of its cost. Could both be true at the same time? That question belongs not only to scholars, but to anyone with a conscience. When historical records meet the forbidden writings, we see two faces of one man. On one side, the traitor who surrendered to greed and sold his soul for 30 pieces of silver. On the other, the reluctant servant who carried God's heaviest burden. Perhaps the true secret is that both lived within him. And that is why his story has endured through centuries, because we too live caught between those same two sides. That night, there was a kiss in the garden, but what intent lay behind it? betrayal, or a sacrifice pressed by obedience? The answer may never be fully known, but one thing is certain: Judas's name rests on the thin line between darkness and light in the human heart, and every generation still searches for its own answer. This chapter closes here, opening the way to the next. Now it is time to see how Judas is remembered in the history of the Church, in the silence, the condemnation, and the shadows cast by centuries of commentary. Just before sunrise in Jerusalem, a heavy silence hung over the city. There were no birds singing, no voices of market vendors, only an uneasy stillness pressing against the stone walls. It felt as though this silence laid an invisible weight upon every heart. For the betrayal that had unfolded that night was not merely the handing over of a friend, but the breaking of humanity's most fragile bond. Through this silence walked Judas. His face carried the shadow of a night that would never see morning. Each step was heavy, the steps of a man crushed beneath his own conscience. The 30 pieces of silver clinked in his pocket, each sound pulling his soul deeper into the abyss. They were no longer a reward but a curse, cold and final, sealing his fate. The marble steps of the temple rose before him. The faces of the priests who had once promised him certainty flickered in his mind, yet now those faces were harder than stone. Judas pulled the silver from his pocket. The coins burned in his palm like fire. As the first rays of dawn caught the metal, their brightness did not blind him, it only made the darkness inside more visible. With trembling hands he hurled the coins at their feet. "I have betrayed an innocent man." Their reply was colder than the stone walls. "That is your concern, not ours." In that moment, Judas's heart collapsed. No cry of repentance, no plea for forgiveness could fill the void. Even the stones of the temple refused to echo his words. The heavens themselves remained silent. Judas turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. While the city stirred awake to meet a new day, he carried within him a night that would never end. A child passed by, clutching his mother's hand tightly. In that gaze, Judas glimpsed his own lost innocence, for the betrayal was not only against Jesus, but against every trace of innocence. His path led him beyond the city walls, into a field. The soil gave way beneath his feet, reminding him of the crushing weight of yesterday's choice. Beneath the shade of a tree, his trembling hands tied a rope. He lifted his eyes toward heaven. "God, if this is the road before me, why is my heart so shattered?" But the sky gave no answer, only the hollow silence carried by the wind. And that silence was heavier than betrayal itself. One last time he remembered the gaze of Jesus. A single word still echoed there: "My friend." Tears blurred his vision as he tightened the rope. And a final question pierced his heart. Was the true betrayal the 30 pieces of silver, or not believing in God's mercy? As Judas's body swayed in the shade of the tree, Jerusalem stirred with another uproar. The temple courtyard filled with voices, debates rising in the crowd. Some declared Jesus guilty, others resisted the judgment, seeing innocence in his eyes. But no one spoke of Judas's tragedy. His name was already sealed with a curse. The priests gathered the scattered silver from the ground and exchanged uneasy glances. "This is blood money," they said. Those coins could no longer rest in the temple treasury. They were defiled. A decision was made. The silver would purchase the potter's field, and when that land merged with the place where Judas ended his life, history would remember it as the field of blood. Some in the crowd whispered that it was God's justice. The traitor's price was sealed in blood. Others remained silent, unsettled. Deep within, they sensed the truth was not so simple. A darker secret still lingered in the shadows of the betrayal, and from that silence rose a question that would echo through the centuries. Does betrayal die with the betrayer, or does its shadow haunt generations yet to come? In the temple courts, the silver coins were gathered one by one. Each faint clink rang like a whisper against the stone floor. The high priests gave quiet orders to the attendant tying the bag shut. A scribe marked a note onto a torn strip of parchment. "Not for the treasury, it is blood money." The ruling was swift. Nothing tainted by those coins would come near the sacred chest. A burial ground for foreigners was needed. Someone remembered a potter's field, soil broken, scarred by clay kilns. By midday, a small delegation left through the city gate. The wind tugged at their parchments as they passed through narrow streets. Outside the walls, on a hillside scattered with broken vessels, the landowner greeted them. His hands, hardened by years of clay, trembled as he lowered his eyes. The bargaining was brief, a seal pressed, a witness summoned, a short prayer spoken, and then the deal was done. Another line was inked on parchment. The field was purchased with blood money. The news spread quickly. "Akeldama," someone murmured in Aramaic, "the field of blood." The name flowed like water through the stones of the city. Children repeated it in play. The elders shook their heads in silence. Can the name of a field tell the story of a man's end? Sometimes it can, for some names are etched not only in language, but in the conscience of all who hear them. Not everyone told the story the same way. Some said, he hanged himself. Others insisted, he fell, he was broken, but all agreed, the silver, the betrayal, the field, it was all bound together, sealed in the name Akeldama, the field of blood. Not everyone in the city told the same story. Some said, he hanged himself. Others whispered, he slipped, the rocks crushed him. Two echoes from the same night, one knotted in the silence of a rope, the other shattered on unforgiving stone. Yet no matter which version people believed, the truth that lingered was this: the cost of betrayal was never paid in silver. It was paid with the human heart. In the temple courtyard, a scribe gathered the scrolls as the late sun dipped low. He paused, eyes drifting to the horizon. The choices made that day would remain, tucked like a faint note in the margin of a verse. The foreigner's graveyard, he murmured, for some coins are silent only in the silence of the dead. An attendant asked where the purse had gone. The scribe replied, its name has changed. It is no longer a purse but a burden. At that same hour, a wind rolled in from the olive grove, carrying a cool breath over the city. As Jesus was led to judgment, the crowd's roar swelled, yet some ears caught a different sound, an echo rising from emptiness, returning like a haunting refrain. From that day on, Judas's name clung to Jerusalem's walls like a shadow. The blood behind a kiss, the silence of a field, the storm trapped in a handful of coins. So the question is not, where did the money go? The deeper question is this: when a piece of land is given a name, does sin move with it? Or does sin remain chained inside the heart that carried it? Each person finds the answer in their own night. Some lift their eyes to search for the light. Others close them and walk willingly into the dark. By evening, a single marker stone was set at the edge of the field newly bought. It bore no inscription, yet everyone knew its name. That stone stood as a silent witness, and whenever the city winds stirred the grass, a single word rose and whispered again, Akeldama. That word marked not just a piece of earth, but the conscience of an age. As Jerusalem's sky grew heavy with stars, a woman in a distant house snuffed out her lamp. May God protect us, she sighed. A father broke bread and handed it to his son. Do what is right, he whispered. For everyone in the city knew, sometimes what one man does unsettles the sleep of an entire city, and sometimes the name of a field casts a shadow over every prayer. When the birds returned at dawn, the stone walls looked no different than before. Only the wind had shifted, and as it swept over the field, it carried the same question once more. Does the crime end when the price is paid? Or does true redemption begin only where no price can be paid? At the break of dawn, new whispers drifted through the streets of Jerusalem. A single word was on every tongue, Akeldama. Some spoke it like a curse, others as proof of God's judgment. Yet all agreed, the name of Judas was no longer just a man's name. It had become a place, a story, a shame. In the marketplace, a merchant leaned toward his neighbor while arranging his goods. Have you heard? No one can work that field bought with blood money. It brings no peace. Women murmured to one another, tell the children to pray when they pass by. That ground is the grave of sin. Fear had taken root in the hearts of the people, mingling with a silent, unspoken guilt of their own. Meanwhile, the disciples were scattered, each wrestling with his own turmoil. A burial place was needed for foreigners. Someone recalled a potter's field, its soil scarred and hollowed by the fires of clay kilns. Before midday, a small group walked out beyond the gates. The wind rattled loose parchments along the narrow streets. On a hillside littered with broken shards, the potter met them. His hands were calloused, his eyes downcast. The bargain was short. A seal, a witness, a prayer, and it was done. A new line was written. The field was purchased with blood money. The name spread like water seeping through stone. Akeldama, they said in Aramaic, field of blood. Children repeated the word as they played. The elders only shook their heads and sighed. Can the name of a place tell the story of a man's end? Sometimes it can, for some names carve themselves not into language, but into the conscience of a people. Yet not everyone in Jerusalem told the same tale. Some claimed, he hanged himself. Others whispered, he stumbled and fell. Near the temple, in a narrow street, voices rose in dispute. The punishment for betrayal was just, some declared. The field of blood will bear his name forever. Others asked, but what of God's mercy? Is any sin beyond forgiveness? The arguments tangled together, but no answer was found, for Judas's story bore the weight of justice and the riddle of mercy. When night fell, the lamps of Jerusalem went dark. Still, a whisper moved through the wind over Akeldama. Not a curse, not a pardon, something in between. The echo of a question left unanswered, and that echo lingered, a knot tied into memory, carried across generations. At noon the next day, for the first time, a funeral was carried into the silent soil of Akeldama. The body belonged to a foreign traveler, a man who had arrived with a caravan, fallen ill in Jerusalem, and died with no kin to claim him. There was nowhere else to bury him. As his body was lowered into the earth, those who stood by whispered, "This land is no longer only Judas's. It will hold every stranger, every nameless soul." And so the land bought with blood became an unexpected symbol of mercy, a final resting place for the forgotten. A rabbi, stroking his beard, spoke softly, "This is God's justice. The ground purchased with tainted silver will not cradle corrupt hearts, but shelter the homeless." The others nodded in silence. No one mentioned Judas by name, yet everyone felt his shadow stretching across the field. That evening, several of the disciples gathered again. A heavy silence lay between them. Each recalled the words of Jesus and weighed them against the unrest in their own hearts. At last one whispered, "His name is cursed, but was he not one of us?" The question only deepened the sorrow in the room. To remember his betrayal was painful, but to bury it in silence was even heavier. Peter closed his eyes, and words broke from his lips like a prayer. Some wounds never close with time, yet perhaps in God's light they take on another meaning. His words trembled in the air, leaving a fragile hope in the hearts of the others. For though Judas's name had been written in darkness, one question remained: can darkness ever fully extinguish the light? As night deepened, a restless wind swept the narrow streets of Jerusalem. In Akeldama, the tall grass stirred, as if the earth itself were whispering. Every betrayal bears its own name, yet the voice of mercy rises from deeper still. This echo was among the first threads of memory to be woven into the fabric of history. For even as Judas's story seemed to end, it was only beginning in the conscience of humankind. And so the tale of Akeldama etched itself into the stones of Jerusalem. It lingered in the murmurs of the people, in the tears of the disciples, and in the cold verdicts of the priests. But the truest question remained, hidden in the shadows. After betrayal, is it justice that endures, or mercy? The answer would be sought in the chapters yet to come, echoing through centuries of debate. Now the path leads us onward, into the next chapter, the Church Fathers and the silence of history, the legacy of Judas. As the first light of dawn touched the stone walls of Jerusalem, the city slowly stirred awake. In the marketplace, merchants called out, animals shuffled their hooves, and distant prayers rose into the air. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of the morning lay a heavy silence. The betrayal of the night before had seeped into the very atmosphere. In the temple shadows, on the faces of the religious leaders, and in the whispers of the crowd, one name lingered: Judas. When the early church fathers spoke that name, they did not see only a man but a symbol. To them, Judas was more than the downfall of one disciple. He was the embodiment of humanity's disloyalty. In their sermons, his story became a warning. Behold the man who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver, and for this his name is cursed forever. Judas became the sharpest example of what it means to turn away from God's light. Yet not all voices agreed. Some writers felt a troubling question press upon their pens. If the Lord knows all things, they asked, why choose Judas? Why allow him to sit at that table? Such questions found no place in official doctrine, for to ask them was to shake the very order of faith. Still the whispers spread, and in those whispers lay the suggestion that Judas was not only a traitor, but perhaps an unavoidable piece of a divine plan. For centuries his name was spoken in churches, sometimes with fury, sometimes with fear. Judas became a haunting mirror, reflecting the possibility of betrayal within every human heart. His image appeared not only in sermons but in children's stories and in the darkest strokes of art, always cloaked in shadow, and still the questions endured. One church father dared to write, "Without betrayal there is no cross, therefore betrayal itself is part of the plan." His words echoed through the ages, though never openly embraced. For if they were, then the curse of betrayal could suddenly be seen as the secret of destiny. Time marched on, empires rose and fell. The writings of the fathers were stored in stone libraries, copied by flickering candlelight in monasteries. Judas's name repeated line after line, warning, curse, fear, and yet beneath it all was a quiet, unspoken curiosity. Because Judas's story was not only the reflection of one man but a mirror of humanity's own frailty. Even now, when the name is spoken, hearts still tremble. Judas, his legacy walks a narrow line between curse and divine purpose. And so the question remains, was he merely a traitor or the keeper of history's most hidden secret? As much as the prayers echoing through the stone walls of monasteries, the lines penned by weary monks under flickering candlelight kept the story of Judas alive. Bent over their parchments, recording the divine word, they trembled each time they wrote his name. For it was not just a name they inscribed, it was a symbol that stirred the deepest fears of the human soul. In some writings, Judas appeared as the devil's sharpest weapon. Darkness seemed to glint from his eyes. Every step he took echoed like a shadow of the abyss. Yet in other texts, hidden between the lines, a different image emerged. Judas as a pawn, drawn into an unavoidable role within the Lord's plan. This version was rarely spoken aloud, for it was far easier for people to accept the simple curse of a traitor than to wrestle with the complexity of divine necessity. From the pulpits, his name rose in different tones. Some preachers thundered it as a curse, others presented him as a lesson to be heeded. To many, he was a warning. When a person turns his back on God, he brings destruction upon himself. But in other sermons, Judas was remembered not only for that dark kiss, but also as a reminder of the potential for betrayal that lingers in us all. For everyone knows, betrayal is not just one man's story, it is a shadow lurking in the heart of humanity. Through the centuries, as these stories were retold, Judas remained both a name and a mirror. Sometimes hated, sometimes feared, sometimes remembered with a silent curiosity, but never forgotten. For Judas is not only one of history's darkest enigmas, but also one of the soul's. As time wore down the stone walls of the church, the questions only deepened. The writings of saints, the debates of denominations, and the whispers of the people left Judas's portrait suspended in shadow between light and darkness. While some cursed him openly, others dared to suggest another possibility. What if there could have been no cross without him? It was a thought too dangerous to proclaim, too heretical to embrace. Yet still, in every century, that whisper echoed again. The silence of the Church Fathers was, in truth, the loudest cry. What they chose not to say echoed far louder than what they spoke. Did they see Judas as a puppet of the devil or as a necessary instrument of God's will? They never answered. And in that silence, his name grew heavier, for every forbidden question sank deeper into the human soul. Even today, his name lingers in whispers. Judas remains cursed as the most condemned figure in history. Yet between the lines of sermons and in the shadows of ancient texts, another possibility hides. Perhaps he was not simply a traitor, but a man bearing the heaviest burden of destiny. It is this uncertainty that makes his legacy endure. And so we ask, is Judas's legacy truly the weight of a curse, or the silent key to salvation? The answer is still unspoken. Perhaps it always will be. Yet the question itself flows through the veins of faith, century after century. Perhaps the real question is this: what do we learn when Judas's name is spoken as a curse? Do we deny our own weaknesses, or are we being summoned to confront them? Every word left by the Church Fathers is a mirror held up to our hearts. For humanity's greatest struggle is not with an enemy outside, but with the betrayal that lurks within. Judas's legacy is not merely the tale of one man, it is the symbol of a struggle between faith and doubt that has echoed across generations. And that is why his name stirs both fear and hope each time it is spoken. For even in the shadow of betrayal, humanity longs for the light of forgiveness. Perhaps this is why Judas's story refuses to fade. It is one of the most piercing questions the human heart asks of itself. And that question does not grow old with time. It is asked again in every age. It echoes again in every soul. Now we too face the same question. If Judas was merely a traitor, how secure are we in our own loyalty? And if his role had a place in God's hidden plan, how can we dismiss the weight of our own choices? This dilemma has never been solved, yet in its mystery, it remains one of the deepest questions guiding the human spirit. And so under the shadow of these questions, we move forward to the next part of our journey, the bridge to the modern world. For Judas's legacy does not rest only in the past, it lives in the betrayals we commit today, in the choices we regret, and in our unending need for forgiveness. Stories often begin in the past, but this time we won't travel from the past to the present. We will move from the present back into the past. Because Judas's betrayal was not only an event on the stone streets of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. That betrayal still lingers among us, at our desks, around our tables, and in the silence we keep, wearing new masks. Perhaps the most dangerous betrayal is not the one sealed with a kiss, but the quiet betrayals we commit every day without noticing. Failing to defend a friend, staying silent when we know the truth, setting aside our beliefs for the sake of gain. Each of these slips into our lives like invisible pieces of silver. What if I told you Judas's story is really our story too? His name is cursed, but the little Judases within us often go unnoticed. That is why in this journey we move from the olive groves of Jerusalem to the glowing lights of today's cities. The questions remain the same. Do we act freely, or are we just players in a script already written? And the deeper question, can we still recognize betrayal, or has the noise of the modern world made us deaf to its voice? Sometimes we ignore a message. If I answer now, it will only bring trouble. Sometimes we hold back a detail on a file. No one will notice anyway. Betrayal no longer comes with swords, it comes with small decisions. There's no need for a kiss. You can betray someone without ever meeting their eyes. A few seconds of silence, a missing word, a delayed warning. They slip through our hands like 30 pieces of silver. Picture a dinner table. 3 people sit together. One dares to pour out their heart. Another turns away. You stare at the rim of your glass, tracing the steam. Better not speak, they won't understand. In that moment, it may not look like betrayal, but it cuts just as deep. Sometimes betrayal is not in words spoken, but in silence held, and silence widens the cracks within the heart. The shadow of that ancient night in the olive groves now stretches across office corridors, hospital rooms, and classroom desks. When a manager changes a report, when a weary doctor overlooks a detail, when a teacher leaves an unfair grade unchallenged, the scales tip. Just this once. And in that instant, a fracture like Judas's own begins to form within us. Because betrayal first silences the conscience, then persuades the mind. Which do you think is more dangerous, a single dramatic fall, or the truth we surrender little by little each day? Choices that look small on paper echo loudly in the soul. Every delay, every silence, every "it's not my problem" opens more space for darkness. And darkness rarely knocks, it waits for us to open the door from within. As Judas quickened his steps in Gethsemane, he carried a fragile balance, fear against opportunity, hope against pride, obedience against reckoning. Our own scales are not so different. We weigh paychecks against compassion, reputation against honesty, applause against God's quiet gaze. Yesterday, he drowned in a bag of silver. Today we drown in quieter coins. Not all coins are money. Some are comfort, approval, recognition. All are currencies. All rest on the scales. The line between being chosen and choosing has never been thinner in the human heart. The question, was I chosen or did I choose, has lingered for 2,000 years. Perhaps that is why, even when we sit at the same table, we break different bread. One tastes gratitude, another tastes fear. And fear often comes before betrayal. Fear opens the door, betrayal walks through it. In today's world, betrayal sometimes wears a new name, strategy. The phrase, "we can't survive unless we do this," can sound more convincing than prophecy. Yet it is not grand prophecies that shape our fate, but the smallest choices. One step back, another compromise, another silent nod, and suddenly we look behind us and can't see where we began. When did I wander this far? But distance is never traveled in a single day. It grows slowly, choice by choice. Reaching for the phone to defend a friend against an unfair comment can be braver today than drawing a sword in Gethsemane. Because now there are no swords, only public shame, no chains, only labels. So perhaps the most urgent question is this: do you want the comfort that fades quickly, or the truth that costs but endures? Comfort warms instantly, truth warms slowly but lasts. Comfort brings applause, truth can bring loneliness. Yet even in that loneliness, there is peace in one gaze, the gaze of God. And his gaze outweighs any silver. Picture yourself lost in a crowd. Everyone marches in the same direction, chanting the same slogan, holding the same sign. Yet your heart whispers something else. I shouldn't be here. But to speak up is to stand alone. It is here that the Judas within us awakens. Sometimes betrayal is not against God, but against our own conscience. Every silence, every time we go along just to belong, we lay another small piece of silver on the table. We live today beneath the spotlight of social media. We see wrong and scroll past. It's not my problem, but one word, one message of support could change a life. We escape heavy burdens with small silences, but every escape leaves a hollow, and that hollow slowly darkens. That night in Gethsemane, Judas's heart was bound by fear. Our hearts know that same grip. Sometimes it is the fear of losing a job, sometimes of rejection, sometimes of being alone. The color of fear shifts, but its weight is constant, and like Judas, we too can lose our way under its weight. But here lies the difference. We can still choose. That night, Judas chose a path, and every day paths lie before us. One is ease, the other righteousness. One is silence, the other courage. Each choice bends the direction of our hearts. So the real question is, which voice speaks louder within you, the voice of fear or the voice of hope? Because fear drives us to silver, but hope leads us to light, and light will always be stronger than darkness if only we choose it. Imagine standing on a bridge. Behind you lies the past. Before you stretches the future. Beneath your feet, the waters carry both Judas's story and your own. Time changes, yet the testing of the heart remains the same. The footsteps that once echoed in Jerusalem's narrow streets now echo on the sidewalks of our modern cities. Yesterday it was a bag of silver. Today it may be a promotion, an approval, an applause. The currency has changed, but the bargain remains. Judas's story is not just about betrayal, it is a mirror. And when we dare to look into it, the question rises, what are my 30 pieces of silver? Perhaps it is comfort, perhaps silence, perhaps a lie told to avoid being broken. Everyone carries a different purse, but the weight inside is the same, conscience. Yet we must remember, forgiveness is as real as betrayal. Judas's tragedy was not only in his betrayal, but in his refusal to reach for mercy. Our path is still open. Even in the darkest moments, we can turn toward the light of God, for grace bends lower than even the heaviest betrayal. So I ask you, which is stronger, the fear in the human heart or the hope offered by God? The answer shapes not only Judas's story, but our own, for at every crossroad, each of us must choose to turn back or to cross over. And here we stand, at the heart of the story. Judas's name is still cursed, but the weight of choice rests on us as well. Perhaps the question is not what he did, but what we dare to do. For in the end, the darkness of betrayal and the light of forgiveness fall upon us both. That night, which began with a kiss, has not ended. The story continues until we decide where we will stand. And now, the path calls us to one final step, a prayer that rises from darkness into light. As the stone streets of Jerusalem grew still, the first light of dawn pierced the night's long silence. The name of Judas had long been cursed, yet the weight of his story rests not only on his heart, but on all of humanity. Betrayal reflects more than one man's failure. It mirrors the weakness hidden in every heart. And now we stand in the place where words fall silent, and only prayer remains. Lord, shine your light into the hidden corners of our hearts. We bring before you the fears we conceal, the wounds we never show, and the guilt we quietly carry. Looking at the falls of those who came before us, help us by your mercy to find our own way back. Standing at the edge where Judas fell, we see our own small betrayals, times when we chose anger instead of love, times when we clung to pride instead of seeking forgiveness, times when we turned away from justice, when silence was easier than truth. But today, in your presence, we lay our darkness before your light. Give us courage, Lord. Do not let us hide our weaknesses. Let us surrender them to you. Wash our hearts with Peter's tears. Teach us John's compassion. Answer Thomas's questions. And above all, engrave on our hearts the words Jesus prayed in Gethsemane, "Not my will, but yours be done." With the same surrender we repeat, "Not our will, but yours be done." Lift us up again, Lord. Do not leave us in the shadow of betrayal, but bring us into the light of forgiveness. Break the chains of pride, accept our repentance, and renew our hope. Remind us that even in darkness, your light never fades. For after every betrayal, your grace shines brighter still. Today we face the same trials. 30 pieces of silver take many forms: greed, fame, power, selfishness. The shadow of betrayal lingers at our table as well. In the glow of phone screens, in the exhaustion of daily work, in moments when we turn our backs on those we love, we too count our silver. Free us from these chains, Lord. Help us see that the ancient story continues in us, that the kiss of Judas echoes in our own choices. Give us hearts that recognize that echo and turn back to you. Teach us to let go of the burdens we have carried for years. Teach us to see your image in our brother and sister, to hear your voice above our own, and to lift the weak instead of scorning them. O Father, be light for those lost in the darkness of betrayal. Free the hearts bound by sin. Knock on the doors of the closed and open them. Give us hearts willing to carry the burdens of others without fear. We confess, Lord, we cannot stand on our own. We fall, we forget, we scatter. But you remain faithful. Your mercy never fails. And so we place our tears in your hands and seek our path in your light. From the depths of our hearts we pray. Lead us from darkness into light, from despair into hope, from betrayal into faithfulness. Not our will, but yours be done. Amen. That's all from us for today. If this video has touched you, if it has blessed you, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Your voice helps this message reach more hearts. Let us walk together, for even in the shadow of betrayal, there is hope in God's forgiveness. And we are called to walk toward that hope. If you'd like, you can listen to our Veritas Deep Stories from the Bible podcast, which gathers all the videos now on screen, or continue on to the next story. Until we meet again, may you walk in His light.